As we begin to sew, there are some basic fabric characteristics that we need to understand because they're going to affect how our garments or our products that we're making are going to perform. So they're going to affect the ability of the actual sewing process can go into play between different types of fabrics, as well as how they're going to hang on the body with that, and then just the aesthetics of our fabrics in making our garments. So the first things that we need to understand is that there are two types of fabrics, or two processes for actually making fabric. So the first of that is weaving. And weaving is the formation of fabric by interlacing two yarns at right angles. So in the weaving process, we actually create what's called a woven fabric. So a woven fabric is going to have yarns that run in what we call the warp or the length direction, as well as the crosswise or the filling direction. And as you look, you can see yarns running up and down, and you can see yarns running across. So we have two yarns that are woven into the loom to make the fabric. As those yarns come in contact with each other in the loom, they go over and under each other to create an interlocking pattern. And as they cross each other, they should actually cross over at right angles. With a piece of fabric, you're going to have an edge that is finished on the two sides of your fabric. That is what we call the selvage. So the selvage is where we get to the edge of the loom and the crosswise yarn comes back in the opposite direction. Depending upon which type of loom that it's woven on, you're going to end up with a smooth bound selvage, or you may end up with a selvage that has fringe on the edges. That doesn't make a difference in the fabric itself. That's just what loom it was actually used to make the fabric. As we look at woven fabric, so we have our selvage, which is the edge of our fabric, and then we talk about the grain. So those yarns that are running in the length direction are what we call our lengthwise grain. This is going to be your strongest direction in your fabric. It's going to have the fabric direction with the least amount of stretch. So as we are sewing, we want to have our fabric pieces for garments. The length of that fabric piece from top to bottom should line up with the lengthwise grain for that, so that we have the strongest direction of our fabric running in the up and down direction of our garment. The yarns that are in the crosswise direction are called the crosswise grain. And these are usually less strong yarns. If you have a fabric that has a lot of surface design on it, you're going to find those specialty yarns in this direction. This is going to give you more stretch in the fabric in the crosswise direction as well. So we like to have this grain run around the body when we sew. This allows the fabric to stretch with our body a little bit more as we sit and we bend, as we walk, to add comfort to that. And the crosswise direction, or the going circumference around our body, is going to have less stress when we're wearing. So we have the stronger yarns run in the length of our garments. We have the crosswise grain run in the circumference of our garments. There are two other types of grains that we also talk about, and that is what we call a bias. The bias is any direction that is not in the lengthwise or the crosswise. So as those yarns are running, so if it's not your warp yarn and it's not your filling yarn interlocking at the 90-degree angle, that's a bias. Bias produces more stretch in our fabric. With that, we have what we call the true bias, and this is a 45-degree angle from your lengthwise and your crosswise grains. The true bias is going to give you the most amount of stretch in your fabric. We use the bias for making trims, so bias trim, because we can stretch it to the shape that we are sewing that trim to. We also will use the bias when we want to create a garment that has a lot of drapeability or that can be very clingy to the body. Cowl necklines are created by using the bias as our grain line for lining up our pattern pieces. So as you are sewing, we're going to look at this when we begin to lay out our pattern pieces, but you're going to want the grain line on your pattern piece to align with the lengthwise grain of your fabric, unless you have a special pattern piece that's going to tell you to place that grain line on the crosswise or to place that grain line on the bias.
Let's look at a piece of woven fabric. So we have the selvage on the right side, and it is a fringed selvage that has the little fringed edges. And then if you look, you can see the lengthwise yarns and the crosswise yarns that are making the fabric. So if we zoom in, you can actually see that you have yarns running in the length direction and running in the cross direction, and they are interlocking or going over and under each other to interlock in place at right angles. The dark spaces in between are actually little spaces of air that are between the yarns that are making the fabric. We can look at the grain of that, the lengthwise grain that runs parallel to the selvage, and the crosswise grain that runs perpendicular to the selvage. If we pull on our fabric in the length direction, we really don't see any movement or stretch in that, because in a woven, that's a very tight, very little stretch in that direction. If we pull in the width, we do begin to see the fabric stretch and to have a little bit of give in that. If we pull in the bias direction, that 45-degree angle, we're going to get much more stretch in that direction.
Second way to make fabric is through the knitting process. The knitting process is the formation of a fabric by interlooping one or more sets of yarns. So you have a single yarn that is looped together in a continuous chain around the fabric that makes the fabric, rather than like in a woven where you have two yarns that are interlaced at right angles. So as we have knitted fabric, you end up with little loops that make that fabric. So you have a yarn that creates a loop and it's continued together in a chain through the knitting process. With a knit fabric, you create a fabric that is very stretchable and very pliable. Again, with the knit, you still have your grain that goes with that. So our loops make vertical rows, and those vertical rows become our lengthwise grain, and they also make horizontal rows as they are being stitched around, and those make your crosswise grain. With a knit fabric, if you happen to pull on the yarn, what can happen is you can actually uncreate or unknit your entire piece of fabric by pulling on that yarn, because it's a loop, and that loop, once it starts unpulling, will unravel your entire piece of fabric. With knit fabrics, because they are very stretchable, they're not recommended for beginner sewers to sew with. It's more recommended that you use a woven fabric, because as you're learning to push that fabric through the machine and guiding that through, it's very easy to get the knit fabric stretched out so that when you're making a seam, you don't get a nice even seam with that. You also can get your fabrics to not line up properly because you stretch one piece of fabric more than you stretch the other piece of fabric.
We look at an example of a knit fabric. We have the selvage on the right side of our fabric, and this is a finished selvage. It is smooth around the edge. With knit fabrics, many times the selvage will roll to the back or to what we call the wrong side of the fabric. And if we look at this piece of fabric, you can see the loops that are being made. If you look at the white stripes, you can see the little circles with the hole in the middle. Those are the actual yarns that have been looped together to actually create the fabric with that. They're in horizontal rolls that keep going up the whole length of the fabric. The grain of the fabric, we have the lengthwise grain that runs parallel to the selvage, we have the crosswise grain that runs perpendicular to the selvage, and we have the bias grain. If we pull on the lengthwise, you can see the amount of stretch that a knit fabric has. In the crosswise, it has even more stretch, so it has a very high stretch in that direction, and the biased has the greatest amount of stretch.
A problem that can happen with both woven fabrics or knit fabrics is that they can become off grain. And what off grain means is that when your woven fabric was being created on the loom or your knit fabric was being created on a knitting machine, as those yarns were interlaced together in a woven fabric or they were knitted together to make your knit fabric, they weren't straight with that. So what happens is that rather in a woven fabric, rather than having your yarns line up interlacing at right angles, they become off. So they're not interlacing right. So how that happens is that the tension on one side of the loom or the knitting machine is more than the other. So as those fabrics or the yarns go through, they don't come through with the same tension. And so your crosswise yarns get off on that. And so you get what's called skewed. And this is going to affect the drapeability of your fabric and your fabric, how it hangs on the body, or if you're making a curtain, how it's going to hang on the wall with that. A second way that you can actually have off grain is that you have what's called a bow. And a bow in your fabric means that the tension on each side is the same, but that the tension in the middle is either less or more than the tension on the sides. And so again, you get your cross yarn not in there at a perpendicular or a 90-degree angle to your lengthwise yarns. So if your tension is not enough in the middle, then you get an upside down line, kind of like a frown. If your tension is too tight in the middle, you're going to end up with a right side and it's going to look more like a smiley face. So as that happens again, it's going to affect the drapeability and the wearability of your fabric because they're not lined up properly with the grain. The other thing that can happen is if you have a fabric that is printed with the design and it's printed off grain. And so what we mean by that is that as the printer ran across the fabric, it wasn't lined up straight. The fabric was not lined up straight or perpendicular or parallel to the design that was going on. And so what happens is that your pattern that's being printed does not follow the grain line. So as you line up your grain line to cut out your pattern piece, you're going to end up with your design being not straight across the edge of your fabric. And that you can see this here. We start with his ear at this yarn. And as we follow that yarn across, we're now in the middle of his ear and we continue across and we're almost to the bottom of his ear. So if this was the hem of your garment, your bear is going to have different amount of your bear showing across the edge of your fabric. So the larger your print, the more dominant or more visible a printed off grain fabric is going to be, versus if you have a small overall print, it may not be that noticeable. If your fabric is printed off grain, there's no way to correct that. So you should always check your fabrics before you purchase them to look and make sure that you're actually going to be printed on grain so that aesthetically you have a nice looking product. It's not going to affect the performance of your product. It's just going to affect the aesthetics.
All fabrics have what we call a right and wrong side. The right side of the fabric is the side that you're going to want to the outside of the garment when it is finished. It's the side that you'll see when you actually put a garment on and you wear a garment. Some fabrics have a true right and wrong side, such as those that are printed. And what that is you have a strong print on the top, and if you flip it over, you can see that the print is much lighter and doesn't come through. So that is the wrong side, and the one with the dominant print is the right side. Some fabrics we call reversible, and they don't have a true right or wrong side. And that is many times when they are solid fabrics, so it doesn't matter which side you use, they look the same. And so either side could be the right or wrong side to the fabric. Some fabrics are the right or wrong side is determined not by the print that's on them, but the actual weaving structure, such as corduroy has a right and a wrong side due to the texture of the fabric. So what you want to make sure that you do is, as you're sewing, you want to place your pattern pieces in a way so that the right sides are going to be out when you're finished sewing, and your seams are going to be on the wrong side of your garment. So as we sew, unless our patterns tell us differently, we will put right sides together when we lay two pieces together to make seams.